I remember when I was younger, this idea of what a video game was had cemented in my mind. Mario Kart and Super Street Fighter 2 on the Super Nintendo was what I was exposed to, and they became the definition of what a video game was. Then I was exposed to something new, a game starring characters that looked like real people in an environment that in my eyes looked photorealistic. A game where you weren't a super soldier, where you only had the bare minimum supplies to fight. A game of intense horror and violence. I had been exposed to violence before, but here it felt so macabre and real. It was just so different to anything I had seen before. I'm sure the same feeling that I described could be attributed to many other people than just myself, because this game made a massive splash on the scene upon its release. That subtle opening text against a black screen is a hallmark of the series, and always does a great job in giving me the creeps. I remember seeing that when I was younger, and it was like this confirmation that this game was going to be something else. That opening tagline really summarizes what made the game feel so different. Its approach. This concept for a game that had a unique blend of horror, cinema, and realism. I can imagine people are tilting their heads in confusion at the thought of me calling Resident Evil realistic, but hear me out. Upon looking in the manual, it has all this confidential information for STARS members only, and it essentially details 2 separate rescue missions around the Arklay Mountains outside Raccoon City. I like how it's not portrayed as epic in the booklet in order to make the setup grander than it is. It's just very matter of fact, and it really puts forward how ordinary a group like STARS is. Because they are ordinary. Special tactics and rescue groups can be found around the world in some form or another. They would almost certainly not be as colourful as portrayed in Resident Evil, but the point is that it's connected to reality. The booklet is also really great for going into the backgrounds of most of the STARS members, even the ones that are only passingly mentioned. It really speaks to the detail that they put into this game. The guns you use aren't just pistol and shotgun. They're Beretta 92FS, Remington 870, Colt Python. You're using real weapons, ones that you can inspect in up-close detail. Everyone always talks about the caretaker's diary, but my favorite note in the game has got to be the scrapbook of newspaper articles. You see the passing of time in relation to the public's view of the biohazard situation. Each page of the scrapbook feels like it's from a different paper. One of them comes right out of some tabloid and tells danger seekers to go explore the Arklay Mountains in search of the monster attacking people. It's so horrifying to read, but you just know that if this were to happen in real life, some awful paper would write the exact same thing. And maybe the creepiest thing about the scrapbook was that someone was collecting these pages. The scrapbook feels completely real, and might be my favorite note of the series. This is part of the reason why the newspaper clippings in the opening are way more effective than just gore shots that were added back in on the DualShock version. The newspaper added to the realism and the mystery, and left more of the horror to your imagination. This is one case where censoring actually made things more effective. On the topic of realism, I have to talk about the backgrounds. This game looked amazing for its time. I can remember just being gobsmacked looking at this game in comparison to its peers of the same period. Gorgeous pre-rendered backgrounds with detailed 3D models. It might not seem like much here now, but on a proper CRT TV, the backgrounds and the 3D models were just seamless and looked fantastic. In the pre-rendered backgrounds, we find one of the other great powers of Resident Evil, which is its camera. It would be simple to approach the scenes in an almost utilitarian way. You know, what camera angle gives the best coverage for the player to attack enemies. But that's not horror, that's not atmosphere, that's not cinema. Its choice in angles is really what puts the creative stamp on this game, and adds so much to the horror atmosphere. This is a bit of a complex topic though, one that requires a video in its own right. The story of Resident Evil, while it has some shortcomings, is quite compelling. The events of the first game seem almost like common knowledge now, even to non-video game players, but transport yourself back in time to 1996. When you walk into the mansion, you really have no idea what is causing all the shenanigans. The game in a few ways tries to trick you with its setting. You're in a haunted house filled with the living dead. Initially, it seems to point squarely on the supernatural. This is exactly how Alone in the Dark started, really, one of Resident Evil's key inspirations. Also remember that this is pre-zombie revival of 2004, where the rules on zombies were fairly loose in people's imaginations. So the game fools you into a certain judgment based off initial information you are given in order to make the unraveling even more impactful through contrast. A genius idea, really. One that has lost its effectiveness on people as the events of the game have become common knowledge. But they became common knowledge because of its initial effectiveness. While the story itself is far from original, even by 1996 standards, it was presented in a really unique way, where you were walking around in the aftermath of this event with these clues in the form of notes that really got your imagination going, recreating the events preceding. The originality of your idea isn't as important, but the way you execute that idea is. And I feel as if Resident Evil did a good job in its execution. Resident Evil is famous for the origin of the term survival horror, where you have a finite amount of resources to combat a threat that is greater than the resources available. That's what it's supposed to be like on paper, but it's only really an action-adventure game, and in a lot of ways, survival horror is just a marketing term. Resident Evil is heavily descendant from Alone in the Dark, which was purely an action-adventure game with spooky elements. And Resident Evil doesn't fall far from its influence, aside from a greater sense of polish in the latter. So what is the line between an action-adventure game and survival horror? Well, I'd argue that a true definition of either is almost impossible, but I have a few vague ideas in relation to this game. A pivotal element I feel is enemy placement. Here's a good example of how to approach enemy placement in a horror game, where you're sandwiched between enemies. You can't take on both at once, so you're vulnerable, and that adds to the horror. But situations like this are actually incredibly rare in Resident Evil, and many of the enemy setups you find have them simply directly ahead with a reasonable amount of distance for you to take them out. It makes rooms feel more routine, and you don't get that sense of vulnerability that you should from a horror game, because you're in a very controllable situation. I don't think that this is an empty point of mine, because in the Director's Cut Arrange mode, the enemy setups are dramatically changed to increase that intensity. A good example of this is one of the new setups where they have zombies who move at different speeds. They place the faster zombies behind the slower ones so that the slow zombies absorb a lot of your attacks, but as you're doing this, you see the fast one barreling towards you. You panic, hesitate on who to shoot first, and by that time, bitten. The arrange mode isn't perfect, but it does have some improvements that put some of the issues in the original game into perspective. Another issue that I find works against the horror aspect in this game is all the ammo you get. People talk about conserving ammo, but in reality you have more than enough to blow away almost every enemy in the game. It's not very tense when you feel as if you have no problem taking on enemies. These elements combined mean that the gameplay can lack the intensity that you'd hope from a horror game, and why I always walk away from it feeling as if it's more of an action-adventure game. It's more horror in theme and style than it is in gameplay. That's not a criticism of the game, more of a reflection and criticism of the term survival horror. You invented this term for this game, and I would argue that your game doesn't even adhere to it. But like I said, at the end of the day, survival horror is a marketing term, so maybe I'm taking it too seriously. The pace of combat in this game is great. You can't fire off rounds with any weapon especially fast, so enemies can close the distance on you while you engage them. Combine that with the fact that you can't take much damage, and you are never fully certain of how much damage you've taken, makes things really tense. Both of these elements, the uncertain health meter and the fact that you can't rapid fire enemies and you actually need to aim between shots, also falls back on the great incorporation of realism, where this idea of realism has encompassed just about every facet of this game. It also has a good sense of gameplay development, where the game ramps up its offense with new and more difficult enemies the further you progress, as well as boss fights that each require radically different approaches. However, I wouldn't say all the enemies introduced complement the game's design. Hunters in this game feel a bit wrong here in the grand scheme of things. It's an enemy that gets its toughness from taking advantage of your lack of overall speed, and it does it in a bit of a cheap way. Let's go backwards for a second and look at the other enemies. Zombies have a decent bit of health and do a decent amount of damage, but are slow. The Cerberuses are fast but have low HP and deal low damage. Even enemies like the Chimera, which are reasonably fast moving and deal a good amount of damage, have these swinging, telegraphing attacks that you can avoid. Hunters, on the other hand, are very fast and will attack you rapidly, to the point where it feels really unfair, especially when the game throws 2 at a time at you, where it is very easy to become stun-locked into an easy death. You'd hope for an enemy that is a little more clever in design, rather than something that is literally built around exploiting every single one of your limitations. The greatest sin in terms of gameplay faults has got to be the regular and lengthy invincibility frames that enemies have. These animations happen upon stunning the enemy, or essentially any animation where the enemy isn't moving toward you. I would imagine that someone unfamiliar with these invincibility frames would be expending close to twice the ammo they normally would be on enemies, making them seem much tougher than they actually are. So I could see why this game came off as harder than it actually is upon its release, because people were unknowingly throwing away ammo. And how were they supposed to know about that? This is the aspect that I would say feels most dated about this game, because this kind of stuff is really unacceptable and is a great recipe for frustration. A common unwarranted complaint about this game is the inventory system, where people seem to see it as some kind of arbitrary limitation rather than a gameplay feature. The inventory system is about setting into the tone of realism and how you're not a super soldier. Arming yourself to the teeth is just going to cause you problems very quickly, something that correlates to Resident Evil and real life. You need to be smart with your slots. What do you need and what do you don't need? You can bring provisions with you in preparation of the worst possible scenario, or you can go out with the bare minimum so you can pick up as many items as you can. You have to work out which approach is the most effective for each situation. Not paying attention and running into inventory trouble is no fault of the game's, and falls squarely back on your inability to plan. Another common complaint with the inventory is how a key and a shotgun weigh completely differently, yet take up the same slot. The items are allocated space based on importance, not how much they actually weigh. Keys are usually the most important items you can carry, so of course they take up an entire slot. I feel as if those who complain about a key taking up a slot are people with poor inventory management looking for excuses. A lot of people seem to dislike the tank controls in these games, which is another point of confusion for me. Tank controls are in the game in the first place because of the camera angles, and going for a more default control scheme would mean that controls would constantly flip and reverse between angles, which would be frustrating. The tank controls do a good job in simulating real-to-life movement than an agile, strafing character. So the tank controls have a gameplay and thematic purpose, so I think the controls are perfectly appropriate, and I've never liked the idea that all games need to play the same. I will say, the controls in the first game don't feel as refined as the preceding games in the series though. The music is great, for the most part at least. That haunting cello sound of the mansion music, the mysterious chimes of the guardhouse, and the music by Forrest's Body is really chilling. These tracks, to me at least, feel timeless, and their effectiveness hasn't been lost on me in all these years. However, it's not all high level, and there are definitely a few tracks that sound very distinctly like mid-90s video game music. So, mostly great on the music front. The voice acting isn't bad. Yeah, you heard me right. It's actually great in a lot of ways. Well, aside from Richard.
There are terrible demons. Ouch!
The problem is with the translation and context. Some of the wording for the dialogue is bizarre, like something you'd find in a surrealist film. It's like this because of bad translation, where the translator is picking the wrong meaning for sentences because they don't know the context of the situation happening in the scene. Neither do the voice actors, I suspect, as well. Combining these two factors produces some frankly hilarious scenes. Everyone goes on about the Jill sandwich and the Master of Unlocking, but that's only because they're early and easily encounterable scenes. Bad ending Jill plus Chris.
Jill, it's you.
Barry?
My God!
Barry at Forrest's Body.
Just take a look at this. It's Forrest. Oh my God.
And Rebecca before the heliport is the funniest shit.
Look at those monsters!
So why do I say the voice acting is good if I just recommended you to go laugh at a few scenes? because it's really memorable. They could have gotten the flattest voice actors to do all the roles, but they got a cast of people willing to put some effort and emotion in. It's a little hammy, sure, but they bring the characters to life. They were just screwed over on the dialogue and direction front. The voice actors themselves did what they could, and I think that shows through.
It's awful!
I worry that I haven't done this game justice in my review and analysis of it. I worry because this is an important cultural artifact that I think some people neglect these days. You might think that the term cultural artifact is too strong a wording for Resident Evil of all things, but if you remove this game from history, then many things that it spurred and influenced disappear with it. This was a game with cultural impact, one beyond video games and into the public zeitgeist. But you know what? It's also just simply a pretty fun game with a lot of really great design. One that, despite its flaws, I always spend the time to revisit to enjoy this conception.